Almost every man misses something crucial, even though it quietly shapes how a woman experiences him. And the interesting part is, women notice it deeply, even if they rarely put it into words. Let me ask you something. Have you ever seen a man who seems to check every box? He looks good, carries confidence, maybe has money, status, or a strong social presence. On paper, he should have no trouble building meaningful connections, yet somehow, things never quite go deeper. Conversations happen, dates happen, but something invisible keeps things from truly clicking, and he's left wondering what he's doing wrong. Here's where things get uncomfortable, but also incredibly eye-opening. Attraction isn't built only on what can be seen or measured. It's not just appearance, success, or charm. What truly shapes how a woman feels about you often lives in the smallest, quietest details, the things most men overlook completely. These are not loud gestures or rehearsed lines. They're subtle, almost invisible behaviors that leave a lasting emotional imprint. And once you begin to understand them, everything about connection starts to shift. Now pause for a moment and really think about this. What if the reason things haven't worked out the way you expected isn't because you're lacking something obvious, but because you're missing something subtle? What if the difference between being liked and being deeply felt comes down to how a woman experiences you emotionally, moment by moment? Have you ever walked away from an interaction thinking everything went well, only to be met with distance later? Or felt like you did everything right, but still didn't leave a lasting impression? If that resonates even a little, then what we're about to explore is going to change how you see connection entirely. My name is Laura Jones, and this is Laura Psychology Diary. And what I want to do here is help you understand something most people never take the time to truly see. Because once you do, you stop guessing, you stop chasing, and instead, you begin to create something far more powerful. A sense of emotional clarity and presence that naturally draws people toward you. So let's go deeper together. Have you ever wondered why some interactions feel effortless, almost magnetic, while others feel like you're trying too hard to hold them together? Why sometimes a woman seems open, warm, and engaged, but something still feels slightly out of reach? These are not random experiences, they're signals. And once you learn how to read them, everything becomes more intentional, more grounded, and far more real. Now imagine this. You're sitting across from someone you genuinely like. The conversation is flowing, there's laughter, there's comfort, and on the surface, everything feels right. But underneath it all, there's a subtle distance. She's present but not fully open, engaged but not completely relaxed. And later, when the moment ends, so does the connection. No follow-up energy, no continuation, just silence. That quiet kind of silence that leaves you questioning what shifted. This is where most men unknowingly lose momentum, not because they said the wrong thing, but because they relied only on words to carry the connection. And here's the truth that changes everything. Women don't connect only through conversation. They connect through emotional experience, through the feeling you create around them, through the energy you bring into the space between you. And one of the most overlooked ways this emotional connection is built is through something incredibly simple, yet deeply powerful, through the energy you bring into the space between you. And one of the most overlooked ways this emotional connection is built is through something incredibly simple, yet deeply powerful. In fact, it's the complete opposite. It's about calm, intentional, respectful touch that feels natural, almost effortless. The kind that doesn't demand attention, but gently shifts how she feels in your presence. Think about how rare it is for someone to feel completely at ease around another person, truly relaxed, not analyzed, not pressured, not rushed, just comfortable. When that feeling exists, something powerful begins to happen. Defenses lower, guard softens, and connection begins to grow without force. A simple moment, like a brief touch on her shoulder when you're both laughing, or a warm, unhurried hug when you meet or say goodbye, can communicate more than an entire conversation ever could. Because these moments are not about action, they're about intention. They signal awareness. They show that you're present, grounded, and emotionally tuned in. And here's something many men don't realize. For most women, emotional safety carries far more weight than physical attraction alone. Without that sense of safety, attraction struggles to deepen. But when it's present, even subtly, everything begins to shift. Non-sexual, respectful touch sends a message without needing words. It tells her that you're not there to take, but to experience the moment with her, that you're aware of her space, her comfort, and her energy. And that awareness is what makes her relax. But this only works when it's genuine, when it's not rushed, not calculated, and not driven by expectation. Because the moment something feels forced, the entire emotional dynamic changes. Instead of feeling safe, she becomes aware. And awareness in that sense creates distance. This is why presence matters so much. Slowing down, actually noticing her responses. Is she leaning in slightly? Is her body relaxed? Is she comfortable maintaining closeness, or does she create space? These are the signals that guide everything. And when you respect those signals without trying to override them, you create trust without needing to ask for it. There's a quiet confidence in restraint, in not rushing the moment, in allowing things to unfold naturally instead of trying to control the outcome. And that kind of control, not over her but over yourself, is deeply attractive, because most men operate from urgency. They feel like if they don't act quickly, they'll lose the moment. But real attraction doesn't disappear when things slow down. It actually grows stronger. It builds in the space where nothing is being forced. And when you begin to embody that calm, grounded presence, something shifts. You stop trying to impress. You stop overthinking every move. And instead, you start responding to the moment as it is, not as you fear it might become. Another layer to this, and this is where things become even more powerful, is emotional awareness. Not just being aware of what you're doing, but tuning into what she's feeling. When you're emotionally aware, you notice the small changes, the slight shift in her tone, the way her posture softens or tightens, the rhythm of her responses. And instead of guessing or reacting impulsively, you begin. What happens next is something most men never pause long enough to notice, yet it quietly determines whether a connection fades away or deepens into something she can't quite explain but keeps thinking about. Because once a woman begins to feel safe and emotionally at ease around you, her mind starts doing something very interesting. It begins to associate you with relief. Not excitement in a loud, overwhelming way, but a grounded, calming kind of presence that feels rare in today's world. And let me ask you something honestly. In a world where most interactions feel rushed, distracted, or surface level, how often do you think someone truly experiences calm, undivided attention? The kind where they don't feel judged, rushed, or subtly pressured to respond in a certain way. That experience alone is powerful. And when you become the person who naturally creates that space, you begin to stand out without trying. Now imagine this. You're with her again. Maybe it's another date, maybe it's just a casual moment together, and something feels different this time. She's a little more open. Her body language is softer. There's less hesitation in how she speaks. She laughs a bit more freely, shares a bit more personally. It's subtle, but it's there. And what you're witnessing in that moment isn't random. It's the result of emotional memory. Because every interaction leaves an imprint. Not necessarily in words, but in feeling. And when those feelings are consistently calm, safe, and positive, her mind begins to categorize you differently. You're no longer just someone she's getting to know. You become someone she feels comfortable returning to. This is where the second layer of attraction begins to unfold. And it has nothing to do with what you say or how you look. It's about how you handle emotional space. Most men, without realizing it, fill every silence. They rush to keep conversations going, thinking that constant talking equals connection. But what they don't see is that true comfort often reveals itself in the pauses, in those quiet moments where nothing needs to be said, yet everything feels understood. Have you ever sat with someone where silence didn't feel awkward, but instead felt natural, almost peaceful? That's not an accident. That's emotional alignment, and it's incredibly rare. When you allow silence to exist without trying to fix it, you communicate something very subtle but very powerful. You show that you're not anxious for validation. You're not performing. You're simply present. And that presence creates a kind of emotional breathing room that most people don't even realize they need. But here's where many men unintentionally break this dynamic. The moment things become quiet, they assume something is wrong. So they rush in with jokes, questions, or random topics just to fill the gap. And in doing that, they interrupt a moment that could have deepened the connection naturally. There's a quiet confidence in being able to sit in stillness without needing to control it. It shows emotional stability. It shows that you're comfortable with yourself. And when someone senses that, they begin to relax even more around you. Now think about her perspective for a moment. She's used to interactions where there's pressure to respond, to engage, to keep things going. But with you, there's space. She doesn't feel rushed. She doesn't feel like she has to entertain or impress. And that feeling is freeing. This is what creates emotional safety on a deeper level. Not just through what you do, but through what you don't do. The restraint, the patience, the ability to let moments unfold without interference. And this is also where anticipation begins to build. Because when you don't overwhelm the interaction with constant input, you leave room for curiosity. She starts to wonder about you, think about you, replay moments in her mind, not because you tried to impress her, but because you gave her space to feel something real. Let me ask you something here. Have you ever noticed how the most memorable conversations aren't always the longest ones? Sometimes it's the ones that leave something unsaid, something unfinished, something that lingers just enough to make you want more. That's not by accident. That's the psychology of emotional pacing. When everything is given too quickly, there's nothing left to explore. But when moments are allowed to breathe, when there's a natural rhythm instead of a forced flow, connection becomes something that unfolds rather than something that's pushed. And this ties into something even deeper, your ability to regulate your own emotional state. Because here's the truth, people don't just respond to what you say or do, they respond to how you feel internally. Your energy, your pace, your level of calm or tension, all of it is being picked up, often unconsciously. If you're anxious, trying too hard, or seeking a specific outcome, that energy is felt. Even if your words seem confident, your presence will say otherwise. But when you're grounded, when you're not attached to how things should go, when you're simply experiencing the moment as it is, that creates a completely different dynamic. It makes her feel like she can relax into the interaction rather than evaluate it. And this is where many men get stuck without realizing it. They focus so much on what to say next that they disconnect from how they're actually feeling. And when you're disconnected from yourself, it becomes impossible to truly connect with someone else. So instead of focusing outward all the time, bring some of that awareness inward. Notice your own pace, your breathing, your need to control or predict what happens next, and slowly begin to release that need. Because the moment you stop trying to manage the outcome is the moment the interaction starts to feel real. Now here's something subtle, but incredibly important. When a woman feels emotionally safe and unpressured around you, she begins to reveal more of her authentic self. Not the version she shows to everyone, but the one she protects. And when that happens, the connection shifts again. It becomes more personal, more meaningful, more real. But this is also where you need to be careful, because as she opens up, many men make the mistake of reacting too strongly. They either try to fix, advise, or impress in response to what she shares. And in doing that, they unintentionally break the emotional flow. Sometimes the most powerful response is simply understanding, listening without interrupting, acknowledging without trying to solve, being present without needing to prove anything. Because what she's really responding to isn't your solution, it's your ability to hold space for her experience. And when you do that consistently, something powerful begins to form. A sense of trust that goes beyond surface-level attraction. Now let's take this one step further. What do you think happens when she starts associating you not just with comfort, but with clarity? When being around you helps her feel more like herself, not less? That's when connection becomes something deeper than attraction. It becomes something she values, and this is where most men never reach. Not because they can't, but because they never learn to slow down enough to allow it. So as you reflect on everything we've just explored, I want you to ask yourself something honestly. Are you trying to create connection, or are you allowing it to happen? Because the difference between those two changes everything. And in the next part, we're going to explore another layer that most people completely overlook. Something that shapes how a woman sees your value over time. Not in the beginning, but in what happens after the moment ends. Now here's where things take a turn that most men never anticipate, because up until this point, everything we've talked about lives inside the interaction itself. The presence, the calm, the emotional safety, the pacing. But what truly defines how a woman sees you over time isn't just what happens when you're with her. It's what happens after you leave, because attraction doesn't exist only in the moment. It continues in her mind long after the interaction ends. Let me ask you something that most people don't think about. After you've spent time with someone, after the conversation fades and the environment changes, what remains? What stays with you? It's not every word that was said. It's not every detail of what happened. It's the feeling, the emotional residue of that experience. And that feeling is what she carries with her. Now imagine this. You've just had a really good time together. There was laughter, comfort, a natural flow. You part ways, everything seems positive. But then, within minutes, messages start coming in, constant texts, over-explaining, trying to hold on to the moment that just happened, and without realizing it, something begins to shift. Not because interest is wrong, but because the energy changes from grounded presence to subtle urgency. And urgency, even in small amounts, can quietly undo the emotional space you worked so naturally to build. This is where the third layer of attraction comes in: emotional afterspace. Most men focus entirely on what to do during the interaction, but they overlook what might be even more important: how to let the moment breathe after it ends. Because when you give space after a meaningful interaction, something powerful happens. You allow her to process the experience, to sit with the feeling, to replay moments in her mind without interruption. And that replay is where attraction deepens. Have you ever noticed how certain experiences become more meaningful after they're over? How you think back on them, revisit small details, feel something stronger in hindsight than you did in the moment? That's exactly how emotional memory works. But when you immediately fill that space with constant communication, you interrupt that natural process. You replace reflection with reaction. Now, this doesn't mean disappearing or playing games. That's not what this is about. It's about understanding rhythm. Emotional pacing doesn't stop when the date ends. It continues afterward. When your presence is calm, consistent, and not overwhelming, it creates a sense of stability. She doesn't feel like she has to keep up with you or respond instantly. Instead, she feels free to come toward you naturally. And here's something important to understand. People value what they have space to feel. If every moment is filled, if every silence is replaced, if every gap is closed too quickly, there's no room for anticipation, no room for curiosity, no room for that subtle emotional pull that makes someone think, I wonder what he's doing right now. But when there's space, when there's a pause, when there's just enough distance for the feeling to settle, that's when you begin to occupy her thoughts without even trying. Now think about this honestly. Have you ever been in a situation where you couldn't stop thinking about someone, not because they were constantly present, but because they weren't? Because there was something unfinished, something open, something that left you wanting to experience them again? That's not coincidence. That's psychological tension. And when it's created naturally, without manipulation, it becomes incredibly powerful. But here's where many men make a critical mistake. They interpret space as risk. They feel like if they don't stay in constant contact, they'll lose her interest. So they try to maintain connection through frequency rather than depth. And in doing that, they unintentionally reduce the emotional impact of their presence. Because when something becomes too available, too predictable, too immediate, it loses its sense of anticipation. Now, this doesn't mean being distant or cold. It means being intentional. There's a difference. Intentional communication carries the same grounded energy as your presence did in person. It's thoughtful, not reactive. It reflects the connection rather than trying to force it. A simple message that acknowledges the moment you shared without trying to extend it endlessly often has far more impact than constant back and forth texting that slowly drains the energy. Because what you're doing is reinforcing the feeling, not replacing it. And when that feeling is reinforced correctly, something very subtle begins to happen. She starts to associate you not just with how she felt in the moment, but with how she feels afterward. That's where emotional consistency is built. Now let's go even deeper, because this is where most people never reach. When a woman feels that your presence doesn't come with pressure, doesn't demand constant attention, and doesn't create emotional urgency, she begins to trust the connection in a different way. It feels stable, it feels grounded, it feels real. And in a world where so many interactions feel fleeting or uncertain, that sense of stability becomes incredibly attractive. But here's the part that requires real awareness. You have to be honest with yourself about your intentions. Are you reaching out because you genuinely want to connect, or because you're trying to relieve your own uncertainty? Because those two energies feel completely different on the receiving end. When communication comes from clarity, it feels calm. When it comes from insecurity, it feels heavy, even if the words themselves seem normal. And this is why self-awareness plays such a huge role in attraction. It's not just about understanding her, it's about understanding yourself in the process. Your ability to sit with uncertainty, to allow space without rushing to fill it, to trust the natural rhythm of connection, that's what creates emotional strength. And that strength is something she feels, even if she can't explain it. Now imagine being the kind of person who doesn't disrupt the emotional flow after a meaningful interaction, but actually enhances it. Someone whose absence doesn't create confusion, but creates reflection. Someone whose presence, even when not physically there, still feels calm and positive. That's when attraction begins to deepen in a way that doesn't need constant reinforcement. And this leads to something even more powerful. When she begins to reach out to you, not because she feels she has to, but because she wants to re-experience how she felt around you. That's when connection becomes mutual. So as you reflect on this, I want you to ask yourself something important. Do you allow moments to settle, or do you rush to hold on to them? Do you trust the connection you've created, or do you try to control what happens next? Because the way you handle what comes after often matters more than what happened during. And in the final part, we're going to explore something that ties all of this together, something deeper than attraction itself, something that determines whether a connection stays temporary or becomes something she truly values and doesn't want to lose. And now we arrive at the part that quietly determines everything. Not just whether she feels something for you in the moment, not just whether she thinks about you afterward, but whether that connection becomes something she truly values, something she holds on to, something she doesn't want to lose. Because attraction, in its early stages, can be built through presence, emotional safety, pacing, and awareness. But what sustains it, what transforms it into something deeper, is something far more internal. It's the way you see yourself. Let me ask you something that might feel a little uncomfortable, but it's important. When you're with a woman you're genuinely interested in, do you feel like you're choosing her, or do you feel like you're being chosen? Do you feel grounded in your own value, or are you quietly hoping she sees something in you that you're not fully sure about yourself? Because this is the layer that most men never address. And yet, it shapes every interaction, every decision, every subtle behavior in ways that are impossible to hide. You can say the right words, you can understand emotional pacing, you can create comfort, space, and even attraction. But if underneath all of that, there's a quiet sense of doubt, a need for validation, a fear of losing her, it will eventually surface. Not always in obvious ways, but in energy, in small shifts, in the way you respond when things feel uncertain. And here's the truth that changes everything. A woman doesn't just respond to how you treat her, she responds to how you carry yourself in relation to her. If she feels that your emotional state depends on her reactions, her attention, her approval, the dynamic subtly shifts. Instead of feeling drawn toward you, she begins to feel the weight of being needed to maintain your sense of stability. And that weight, even when unspoken, creates distance. But when you are grounded in your own sense of self, when your emotional balance doesn't rely on her responses, something completely different happens. You show up fully, genuinely, without needing anything in return. And that creates a kind of freedom in the interaction that is incredibly rare. Now pause and really reflect on this. Think about the people you feel most comfortable around, the ones who don't make you feel like you have to perform or meet expectations or carry emotional responsibility for them. What do they all have in common? They're already okay within themselves. They're not trying to extract something from you. They're not subtly seeking reassurance through every interaction. They're simply present, and that presence feels light, easy, and real. That's exactly what creates lasting attraction. Because when a woman feels that being around you doesn't come with pressure, doesn't come with emotional obligation, doesn't come with the need to constantly validate you. She relaxes into the connection in a completely different way. It becomes something she chooses, not something she feels responsible for. And this is where everything we've talked about begins to come together. The calm, intentional touch, it comes from being grounded, not from trying to create a reaction. The ability to sit in silence, it comes from being comfortable within yourself, not from forcing connection. The space you give after the interaction, it comes from trusting your value, not from fearing loss. All of it traces back to one thing: your internal stability. Now here's where it gets even more important. This doesn't mean becoming distant, detached, or emotionally unavailable. That's a common misunderstanding. True confidence isn't cold. It's not about withholding or creating artificial distance. It's about being open without being dependent. It's about being interested without being attached to a specific outcome. It's about showing up fully while still remaining grounded in yourself. And that balance is what creates depth. Because when you combine emotional awareness with internal stability, you become someone who can create connection without losing yourself in it. And that's rare. Now let me ask you something that might shift your perspective completely. What if the goal was never to make her like you, but to create an experience where both of you naturally feel drawn to each other? What if instead of trying to hold on to someone, you focused on becoming someone who naturally creates a space others want to return to? Because when you approach connection from that place, everything changes. You stop chasing, you stop overthinking, you stop trying to control every outcome, and instead, you start experiencing. You notice more, you feel more grounded, you respond instead of react. And most importantly, you allow people to come toward you rather than trying to pull them closer. Now here's something that most people don't realize until much later. The strongest connections are not built on intensity alone. They're built on consistency of feeling. It's not about creating one perfect moment. It's about creating a pattern of emotional experience that feels safe, real, and grounding over time. And when that pattern is consistent, it builds trust. When trust builds, attachment follows naturally. And when attachment forms without pressure, it becomes something meaningful, something lasting. So as you take all of this in, I want you to reflect on something honestly. Not from a place of judgment, but from awareness. Where do you tend to rush? Where do you try to control instead of allowing? Where do you seek reassurance instead of trusting what you've already created? Because those are the moments where connection either deepens or quietly slips away. And the more aware you become of those patterns, the more naturally things begin to shift. You don't need to become someone else. You don't need to memorize techniques or follow scripts. You simply need to slow down enough to see what's already happening and respond with clarity instead of fear. And when you do that consistently, something powerful begins to unfold. You become someone whose presence feels different, someone who creates calm instead of pressure, someone who builds connection without forcing it, someone who leaves an impression not through effort, but through awareness. And that's the kind of connection that stays. If this made you pause, reflect, or see something differently within yourself, take a moment to engage with it. Let it sit with you. And if you feel like this is something more people need to understand, share it with someone who might benefit from it. And if you haven't already, subscribe and stay connected. Because what we're exploring here isn't just about relationships. It's about understanding human behavior on a deeper level. And once you start seeing it clearly, you'll never experience connection the same way again.